Welcome to Founder Radio. I'm your host, Hugo. In this podcast, you'll hear in-depth conversations with the globe's most exciting company founders. We'll talk about their ideas, their successes, their challenges, and their learnings along the way. At Founder Radio, we celebrate founders. And we believe that innovative founders are critical to deal with the challenges humans face. They are society's explorers and work in uncertainty to expand our practical knowledge each and every day. Building something from scratch requires creativity, intelligence, conviction, and endurance. Get inspired and learn from those that are changing the world. Hello everyone, welcome back. Thanks for listening to Founder Radio. Today we're talking to Karun. He's the co-founder of GetVantage and its chief growth officer. GetVantage invests between 25k and 2.5 million in emerging businesses in India across certain sectors. For example, eCommerce, SaaS, gaming, and cleantech. He's also an investor and advisor in GajiGesa, whose founder Vidit was on this podcast earlier on. Karun has a PR and comms background and has 15 years of experience at both corporates and scale-ups before starting GetVantage. Karun, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Hugo. It's a pleasure. I've been waiting to jump on this podcast with you for a while.
Fantastic. I'm very much looking forward to it. Let's dive in right away. You told me that 30% of India's GDP comes from SMEs. That means, right, on an Indian scale, that's 15 million individual businesses. And they face $500 to $700 billion funding gap. Could you tell us a bit more about what that funding gap is exactly and how you're solving it with GetVantage?
Absolutely. I think these numbers sort of don't make sense, right? That's what's so exciting about, I guess, the opportunity we have in an emerging economy like India, and specifically for us trying to bridge this credit gap that exists as well. Give you a little bit of context as well. Historically, and this is true for pretty much every economy, traditional financial institutions just have never been able to serve the emerging businesses and small businesses. There's always been a credit gap. The reason for this is lack of collateral, lack of understanding of these business models, not having the right kind of risk appetite to be able to serve these young businesses that don't have sort of the credit profile or the vintage when looked at through a historical or traditional lens of underwriting. And that's what we are trying to solve here in India. I think, over the last 10, 15 years, there has been a lot of progress in opening up financial access to small business owners in India. And that's where you start to hear about a term which is NBFCs, or non-banking financial companies. And these are entities that aren't banks, right? These are new age companies that are trying to do lending and trying to do it in a different way, also trying to cater to this large underserved, and I would say more underserved segment at this point rather than unserved, although the unserved is something we'll get into in a second as well. For example, today in India, we did a study last year where the findings, again, were just pretty incredible. And there's, if you look at this overall pool of MSMEs, it's about 65 million MSMEs in India. And the credit requirement for them, there's various reports, but it ranges between $500 billion to $1.5 trillion. And it's only growing year on year. However, what's actually being met is only about $50 to $80 billion. So you can already start to see that last year, for example, just for a smaller pool of these MSMEs, there was a credit requirement of $270 billion, of which only $53 billion was being met, right? So the actual gap itself was in excess of about $170 billion or $200 billion. That's supposed to scale up to at least 2x just in the next 3 to 5 years. And if you start to look at what that looks like 8 years out or a decade out, it's truly mind-boggling because those numbers just don't start to make sense anymore. But at the same time, that's the role we have, right? That's where we see a massive opportunity, and not just us. That's where many other companies, whether they're NBFCs or fintechs, see a massive opportunity. And I think what's truly exciting, and I'm sure we'll sort of explore this a bit more further down the line, is the ability to open and unlock financial access to these millions of MSMEs is not easy, and it is only going to happen with the power of technology, right? The technological progress that we're seeing in what is being known as the India stack is truly game changing for the Indian economy. And at the same time, I think you'll start to see a lot of learnings and lessons being implemented by other global economies as well, because of how well this India stack has been thought of. And it's going to make India what we like. I mean, in the West or everywhere else, we like to use this term future ready, right? Or future proofed. And that's exactly what this is designed to do. It started with identity, it moved to payments, and now we're looking at the actual infrastructure for being able to run truly interoperable lending, which makes lending accessible to any business, no matter where in India you are and what kind of vintage you might have.
And what does that part of the infrastructure look like? And how is that really enabling you and maybe other players to bank the underbanked SMEs that you were talking about?
Yeah, so great question again, Hugo. I think I'll start. I think I don't know how deep we'll go into each of these, but I'll try and give you just some context, right, for the listeners out there as well. Is in India we started. There was no national identity system for the longest time, right? And there was a team in the company called iSpurt, bunch of volunteers, really, really visionary volunteers that came together and essentially created Aadhaar, which is today, over 1 billion people have a national identity in India, right? It took years to ideate and years to implement, but today almost every single person in India has to have the single identity. That was the first step, right? Putting every single citizen of India on the map effectively, with access to an identity which is recognized by all of the different authorities in India. What came next was something called UPI, which I think you would also be familiar with, and most viewers out there are now familiar with, because it's transformed the landscape of making payments between any two parties in India. There's no more a requirement for having a middleman, right? So there's no charges. It's free to be able to send money to, from me to you if you were also in India and you were a citizen of India, or from me to a business, or from a business to me, right? Effectively to collect payments. Let's put it that way. It's called the United Payments Interface. This completely transformed the payments landscape in India and continues to do so. And what comes next is going to be lending, right? And I'm not talking about consumer or consumptive lending at all. I'm talking about truly productive lending, which is going towards priority sectors like micro, small, and medium enterprises, which, as we were talking in the context of that, has been undersurfaced so long. How this works is truly fascinating. It's the same way how you have, your internet protocols, right? What they've created in India, again, it's iSpurt that's behind this. They've created what is called OCEN, which is the Open Credit Enablement Network. It's nothing but a protocol and framework for all of the stakeholders in the digital lending ecosystem in India. And to further sort of clarify, not just the digital lending ecosystem, but the digital lending for specifically MSMEs. All of the stakeholders in that ecosystem. So whether you're a bank, whether you're an NBFC, whether you're a fintech, whether you're a borrower or a borrower's agent in this case, or a loan agent in another case, or you have part of the collection stack as well, and you only want to be a technology provider. It first and foremost distinguishes all of the different roles and responsibilities that need to exist and categorizes them in a very clear and clean manner, so that there's no ambiguity. There's absolute clarity in exactly what each of the players in this ecosystem should be doing and what kind of responsibilities they take on. And depending on the responsibilities they want to take on, what kind of regulatory requirements or compliance requirements they would need to meet as well. That's number one. Two, it allows for essentially a plug-and-play system. The same way today you push in a plug into a wall socket, that's how this framework has been designed. And only when that handshake happens, so that's exactly what this is designed to do. It's essentially enabling that handshake to happen in an open protocol in which you can have any of these participants that we were sort of talking about, whether you're a loan agent, a borrow agent, a borrower, a lender, collections agent. All of those essentially can be plugged into the protocol, and that handshake becomes essentially very efficient and streamlined. So there's absolute clarity in exactly what's happening. And I think the ability for this would not have been possible 5 years ago or even 10 years ago, because you needed those other aspects of the India stack to essentially have matured before you were able to introduce something like this. And that's what's really exciting. That's also where a company like GetVantage now has dual roles to play, because we're both a lender, because we actually have our own NBFC license, which is licensed by the Reserve Bank of India, and our technology platform, which allows us to essentially play the role of a borrower agent at the front end. A way to sort of contextualize this and make it a little bit more easily relatable is the same way you have Google Pay today, or you have some of these other apps that you might be using. It's essentially the front end. You don't really know what's going on at the back end, or if there's any intrinsic value beyond just a great UI customer experience that you're using a particular app for sometimes, especially in India. So in India, you can, like I said, in terms of making payments, I can actually make payments through the app for whatever bank I'm using. So say I'm using ICICI in India, or DBS, for example. Those apps allow me to make payments to any entity in India. So there's no real use case for a GPay, or at least for me, there's no real use case for a GPay or for a PhonePe or some of these other apps, because it's just the wrapper at the front end. But my bank app allows me to do the exact same thing, right? In a very secure environment, and one that I might be more comfortable with. Similarly, not to disregard the value of these apps, but for some people, the usability, the customer experience of using an app like GPay is so fantastic that they don't want to use a bank app, because some of these bank apps tend to be not as user-friendly. And that's really what this protocol is being designed to do, is to make access to capital, and working capital especially, for micro and small and medium enterprises in India, far easier, right? And far more transparent as well.
Sounds like an incredible leap forward in terms of the overall payment system and the financial infrastructure, and great that you're now enabled to serve that wave, so to say. And Karun, how do you find your counterparties? Is the GetVantage business based on a separate marketplace, so to say, where you match supply and demand, or is there on top of the nationally built infrastructure a way of for SMEs to find financiers? And how does it work once these two parties have found each other? How do you leverage that infrastructure, and what additional information do you need from the borrowers?
Yeah, no, great question. So I think this is actually a very multifaceted question. So I'll try and break it up into two parts. How do we as a company operate today, and where are we going, right? How are these evolutions and fantastic developments being made by the India stack? How is that going to transform what we're attempting to do already? So the first part of this question, what do we do today? Today, GetVantage operates like many other companies around the world that are doing growth capital, right? And there's companies in Europe. I'll name a couple of them. There's CapChase, which is sort of leading the charge there. There's Arc as well. In the United States, there have been companies like Lighter Capital, Pipe, which is obviously transformed and now is focused on embedded finance as well. Clearco has been around for a long time, and they're going through a sort of recalibration. And I think what we do today is that any company can actually come and find us, right? The easiest way to find us is online, because we're a digital-first company, or a tech-first company. And we try and digitalize the entire journey of getting access to small business finance. And I think powerful thing is that we're completely sector agnostic. So you can be a traditional SME that has an offline business and maybe is in the world of manufacturing. You can be a e-commerce company that is selling shoes and socks online on Amazon. You can be a SaaS company that is selling software in India and to the world. Or you could be a health tech company, or an HR tech company, or you could be a small cloud kitchen selling burgers to people in India. We are able to underwrite all of those businesses using traditional and non-traditional data points, do that in a hyper-efficient manner that happens within essentially 48 to 72 hours, and able to disburse to them various structures of financing, which are all under the umbrella of cash flow-based financing models, within 7 to 10 working days. Now, this kind of recalibration in terms of how business finance or small business finance has been delivered is happening here for the first time.
Within 7 to 10 days, you said?
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
insane.
Where if you think about traditional models, it's been months, right? Or at least 3 to 5 weeks minimum if you're going to a bank. And a bank would take collateral, they would take personal guarantees. If you didn't have a certain business credit profile or personal credit profile, they wouldn't even entertain you. And that's really the gap that we found. And that's the gap we're trying to solve is fundraising, whether it's debt or equity, and it's always debt and equity. It's never just equity. I want to clarify that as well, is very hard. If you're raising equity, that process could take 6 months in today's environment. It's sometimes very hard to even get a meeting unless you know the right people at a particular fund and unless they have a distinct thesis in your area of operation. Good luck getting funding from that particular investor. On the debt side, banks take at least 3 to 5 weeks and come with all of those requirements I just mentioned. Other financial institutions will require other collaterals and things like that as well, or warrants or convertible notes and things like that if you're looking at venture debt. And even venture debt is only accessible if you've raised equity. So that's the white space we found, right? That's the opportunity we figured is building a business is incredibly hard already. Fundraising does not need to be that hard. Fundraising can be a bit more frictionless and less cumbersome, where it's not taking up the amount of bandwidth that should be spent on actual growth of the business itself.
Got it.
And so what we try and say is we're like, you guys, like to all founders and business owners, you focus on growth, you focus on the business and leave the fundraising to us.
There's plenty of CEOs that spend half or more of their time fundraising, so they'll be delighted with this option. And Karun,
absolutely.
How do you, because I'm sure you'll be flooded with requests, how do you eventually judge whether you are willing to lend a particular SME and how much and under what terms? And let me split that up maybe in two parts. Like, what's the information that you demand, and then what's your model to make those kinds of decisions?
Great question. So as I said, very simple. The short answer is we take traditional and non-traditional data points. So the traditional data points are everything you think of. They're like all your bank statements, your GST, which is your tax filings, your KYC and KYB information on the promoters of the company, on the business as well, which includes sort of registration information, etc. And of course, your MIS, all of your financial statements, etc., also on the business. Those are your traditional data points, right? The non-traditional data points that we look at are for any business that has any sort of revenues coming in from online channels as well. And most businesses today do. So we plug into your marketplace accounts. That's the equivalent of essentially connecting your Amazon account if you're selling on Amazon, or your Shopify store if you're selling on Shopify, as an example. Like that, any marketplace accounts, your payment gateways, we can connect those to our platforms as well. So we see real-time cash flows and inflows as well. And of course, things like your marketing channels and or logistics accounts. So that we, again, in India, you see a lot of cash on delivery, right? So the ability to connect all of these accounts, we get to see a real-time view on cash inflows and outflows, which is crucial to us to be able to understand the actual health of a business. Think of it like an ECG machine for the heart, right? It gives you a sense of your pulse real time. That's exactly what we try and do for a business as well. It allows us to understand historical data as well as forecast and project data moving forward. So combining these two and triangulating this information, again, why I say triangulation? Because you have financial information, you have sales and marketplace and revenue information, and tax information, right? Triangulating all of this data in real time allows us to essentially create a GetVantage score for a particular business. That GB score, again, has a number of hard parameters and soft parameters, which we look at, and of course, we do soft pulls where we're looking at, has this business been in the news? What is that sector this particular business is operating in? What is the outlook for that particular sector? What is the activity happening in that particular sector as well? What is the risk profile of that sector? Is this a sector that, and I'm going to give you contextual again, a couple of years ago, people were saying the D2C or e-commerce sector in India, so when I say D2C, it's direct-to-consumer brands like, you could be a t-shirt brand or a food, a peanut butter brand or whatever, selling online. Everyone was saying this was a bubble, right? Because there was so much activity in the space, so many new emerging brands coming into this space as well. But it was short-lived. It lasted 6 months where people were like, oh, this is a bubble. And again, literally the last quarter, there's been so much activity in this space, so much more investment And literally every venture capital investor is saying this is the beginning of a huge growth story for India, right? I have a slightly different view. I think, of course, it is. You were absolutely at this cusp of a breakout for truly iconic Indian brands to emerge over the next 10, 20 years. At the same time, you will see consolidation because as you have so many young entrepreneurs coming into the landscape, not all of them are going to make good decisions, unfortunately, right? So you will see companies that fail. You will see consolidation as well happen as people are able to build good brands with strong traction, but maybe don't have the resources to scale that up to the way they want. And larger brands will come along and buy them. So I think it's really fascinating to be able to pull all of these data points together. And that's what we look at in analyzing a business. And I think that GV score becomes crucial in our ability to underwrite and then fund a lot of these new age businesses as well.
And is GV the score where you synthesize all of that information you mentioned? Or is
Yes.
that part of your overall assessment of a certain business?
It's a part of the overall assessment, but essentially that's the like we all have a credit score. That's essentially what this is doing as well, is giving a score to the business. And similarly, like essentially if it's under 600, you wouldn't touch that business. If it's between 600 and 700, it's a business that's fundable and there's risk-based pricing that would apply. If it's above 700, it's almost a guarantee that we'd fund it, for example.
And I like the way you're quantifying it. It will also allow you 5 years from now to have a look at, hey, how did the businesses with score X do? How did they correlate to payback, etc. So that will get only better over time, I imagine.
Absolutely. And I think it also I'll just add one thing here, Hugo, which is interesting, is I think it also, by really focusing on how we accurately are able to design a score like this, and it only improves over time with, and I hate to use the jargon, but that's where AI ML comes in, right? It helps us make sure that the score is only getting better and smarter over time and more accurate over time. It allows us to potentially in the future collaborate with the industry and with the government to actually create a legitimate, recognizable score for small businesses in India. Right? And I think that becomes a very powerful tool potentially if we're able to do that over time.
Especially in combination with those two new frameworks that you described.
Exactly.
And Karun, your motto is no bias, no excuses, no bullshit, no equity, no collateral, no personal guarantees, no interest, no board seats. That's great. Equally, I wonder, how do you make sure you get your money back in a situation where things don't play out as anticipated?
Great question, Hugo. And I think this goes back. The two ways we mitigate risk are primarily, one, using this tech-first approach to do our underwriting, right? I think we have extreme confidence in our ability to underwrite businesses really well. And I think the proof lies in the pudding. And for us, the pudding is data. 4 years since we've been in operation, we've deployed in excess of about $120 million, or in the Indian rupee, it's about 1,200 crores so far. And our NPAs are less than 0.7%. That just goes to show that, we're doing a great job so far, right? And we have to continue improving. So that's number one is underwriting. And number two is we're, again, going back to what I was talking about, the India stack. What the India stack and what companies today have allowed us to do are high frequency or automated collections. So again, I'm going to try and give you a global context or a global example and then relate that back to India as well. So Stripe, which is one of the largest payment gateways and payment processors in the world, they have something called split payments. And the Stripe equivalent in India is a company called Razorpay. They introduced the same thing here about 4 years ago. And that tools like that, and all payment gateways today effectively have that. For some, it's called payouts. For some, it's called split settlements. That essentially allows you to plug in to a revenue stream for a particular company and split revenues and split payments or repayments at the point of sale. What that does is, as opposed to getting money or getting repaid at the end of a month in terms of traditional bullet repayments at the end of a month or a particular period, here we're essentially collecting back part of what's owed to us every single day. And not even just every single day, it's technically in every single transaction,
continuously,
which adds up to every single day which adds up to a week, which adds up to a month.
So part of your agreement with a borrower would be, hey, we set up this split pay thing, we get X%, and that's where you already start receiving repayments from day one.
Yes, and that's where, so sometimes people misunderstand the term or the product revenue-based financing. What we like to actually say today is it's revenue-based repayments, right? And that we get paid based on your revenues, and it's on our revenue share that we have with you, and that's what the agreement is based on.
That's awesome. Karun, tell us a bit more about the early days. Where did the idea come from? How did you meet your co-founders, and how did you get started?
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, so this is actually a fantastic story. So I'm actually going to call myself part of the founding team, and I don't like to call myself a co-founder at all because I wasn't here, right? I wasn't on the ground here building this business with these guys, and it's just a funny story where the co-founders are actually Bhavik and Amit. Bhavik is a dear friend of mine and somebody I've known for 20 plus years, and we've been fantastic friends in that time. He actually had the idea, all credit to him, he actually had the idea for GetVantage back in 2015 when I think you and I were both at Uber. And I remember this conversation so vividly. He was like, I have this idea for this business, and this is what it's going to do. It's small business financing. It's going to be revenue based and cash flow based. And I was like, yeah, great idea. But I think I'm having too much fun right now at Uber, and he was having too much fun in his company at the time where he was chief growth officer, funnily enough. And I said, but this is a great idea. We have to revisit this when you and I both have a bit more time. And so in 2018, he actually took a year off. He was on sabbatical after he exited his previous company. I was just starting out with my previous company, which was another fintech company in Southeast Asia. And he, just at the end of this 1 year sabbatical, because he was also having his daughter or his baby at the time, I said, hey man, like you've kind of been on the sidelines for a year, but you've spent 10 plus years in India building a fantastic network, gaining a tremendous amount of experience. And if you continue being on the sidelines, you're going to end up losing a lot of that, right? And it's about time you get back into the game. And that idea we had and we had discussed and, kind of created a very first PowerPoint for many years ago. Why don't we explore that, right? And then a few months later, he was actually in Singapore for Money 2020, which is this big sort of fintech conference that happens around the world. And this was the Asia edition. The founder of Razorpay was there, and Bhavik knows him quite well. And they were talking about some of the new features that they were coming out with, and split settlements was one of them, right? So that development had to happen, and that really kicked off I guess you could say, the impetus for us to get shit done and get off our butts and get moving to actually go and build this. And that's really what we did, right? We started very early days of this company in 2019. Bhavik and Amit, the other co-founder, they've known each other for a long time as well. Amit has a background in fintech also. And, I think Bhavik really reached out to Amit and was like, hey, like this is a great opportunity. I think the broader macroeconomic developments in India are going to help over the next few years to unlock a lot of this opportunity for companies like us if we play our cards right. And that's how they started, right? They had a small team of engineers and I think this is very different. This was a very different approach to most founding teams and companies where literally for the first 6 to 9 months, there was no BD, right? We didn't go out there try and win new business. The focus was just on building tech, right? And they built, I don't even want to say they built the entire tech stack in-house, right? In that first 6 to 9 month period. And only once we were completely ready and we believed in the system and what the team had built, did we start to go out there and try and get the first deal, right? Or the first business to come and get funded by us. And that was really hard because what happened in the first 6 months of 2020, COVID hit. Right. And so this was all then being done remotely, or at least part remotely. People were scared. There was so much uncertainty going around as to, the depth and duration of COVID and how long this kind of thing would continue. But it also had its silver lining for us in terms of businesses started to go more online and businesses really needed working capital. So, the silver lining for us was it really truly presented us that opportunity to meet a very dire requirement, and it became the need of the hour. effectively.
And was that order, Karun, deliberate in terms of first building and then talk to customers? Because a lot of people will shout off the roofs, talk to your potential customers before anything else, right? And only then start building in the direction of the stuff they tell you they want. So was that very deliberate defiance of that common wisdom?
Yes, absolutely. And this goes back to, again, Bhavik and Amit, who at the core, and I say we here because I'm just going to throw myself in there, but it's them, right? I think they really knew from day zero that to do what we wanted to do differently and have the kind of actual impact on the venture finance landscape that we wanted to, we had to have a tech-first approach to this, right? So there was no other way that they were going to do this. Having said that, I do want to make sure people don't misunderstand. It's not like everything was 100% digital from day one for us, right? That's not how things work in India, and that's not how things work in a startup, as you know. You fake it till you make it, and you fake it till you break it, right? And for us, a lot of things were still happening offline, but we were making sure that there was some aspect of technology driving efficiency, driving the business, right? And that was something that was core to the DNA from the very beginning.
Got it. On that note, I even heard that the Stripe brothers first built the front end and then cycled to the bank whenever they got a payment. So you're in good company there.
Yeah, there you go.
Did you consider many other ideas in the space?
Yeah, so, I think interesting question, and it'll probably allude to something we can talk about a little bit more later. And actually, we started the conversation with as well, which is embedded finance. But no, right? I think when we started off, we knew we wanted to do small business financing. And in a sense, we had learned from a lot of the global peers, right? I named a couple of them earlier. Clearco was one of the sort of the pioneers in the space in the United States. Unfortunately, they made probably some wrong moves and tried to grow too aggressively a few years ago. But there are a lot of companies in this space that have been doing small business financing, revenue-based financing, cash flow-based financing, recurring revenue-based financing, whatever you name it. These models have been around for a long time. In India as well, they've existed in different avatars. The only difference was that no one had taken a tech-first approach to this, right? And again, I go back to saying this would have been impossible to do 10 years ago in India. It just happened to be the right time over the last 4 or 5 years where different developments, different stakeholders within the overall ecosystem, whether it's e-commerce, payments, other digital infrastructure, Razorpay as an example, these developments, these features had to be introduced before we could come into the market, right? And for us, we always knew. So here's an interesting little tidbit. When we started off as being a revenue-based financing fintech platform. And the reason for that was we knew revenue-based financing was going to be our first product, but it was never going to be our namesake. And it was never going to be the only thing we were known for. The reason we pushed the revenue-based financing positioning and message so aggressively over the last 3.5, 4 years was because we had to differentiate ourselves from the other lenders and lending types and lending products that existed in the market. If we were the same, we would have been too small and we would have got no attention. We had to differentiate ourselves from an optics and a PR marketing standpoint. It's something we really had to focus on. I think we did a fantastic job to truly make revenue-based financing and cash flow-based financing part of the lexicon in financial services and venture finance in India.
Well played. And when did you know you were onto something? When did you start feeling the traction?
That's a great question. I would actually say, so Bhavik and Amit and the team were actually on the ground here in India. I was stuck in Singapore through COVID because they had extremely strict travel restrictions. And, I think when they I think even before we started funding, when we started having conversations with some of our lending partners and a lot of the other founders in the market, and these are just offline sort of informal conversations, what you very quickly started to understand was this was the need of the hour, right? So that's number one. That was like, okay, guys, we're doing something right here if this is what people want. So it ticked that box. And then two, as soon as we started being able to fund, the first cohort of companies effectively, the efficiency with which the team was able to do some of these deals was kind of a, come to Jesus moment in a way where we're like, whoa, we're actually being able to deploy capital to these businesses, whether it's $10,000 or $100,000 or $500,000 in 10, 15 days. This was unheard of in the market, right? And so when you're able to redefine an experience so significantly, you kind of know, and people take notice, and they're like, wow, that was an incredible experience. Thank you so much for helping me get access to this working capital. You kind of know that you're going to transform part of this industry just because you're able to introduce a delightful customer experience, right? In what has traditionally been known as probably the most cumbersome, like, have you ever tried getting a loan from a bank? It's not a very happy experience, right?
No, it isn't. It's painful. And I hear a lot of people complain about it.
Yeah. And, it goes back to, and like, I think, the easy one to relate to us would be like Uber, right? It was just, why did it change the world, change transportation globally? Because it just made getting, like, you could push a button and get a ride. Like, that was the experience. You didn't have to worry about speaking the language, knowing where you're going in a new city, having the right currency. It just worked.
It was a magical experience compared to the status quo. And it sounds like that's what you've done with SME financing.
Yeah, and that's what we continue trying to do. I think we've made progress, but we're very early, right? I think 3.5 years being a financial services company or a fintech company in a market like India, which is evolving as quickly as it is, we're only just getting started. And I go back to this, right? I'll contextualize this for you very simply. We talked about at the beginning of this conversation about the opportunity. It's a $500 billion to $1.5 trillion opportunity. We've only deployed $100 million in the last 4 years, right? So we haven't even scratched the surface of what we're truly going to be able to do if the industry works together, and if, as an industry, we're able to collaboratively work with policymakers in India, which is the RBI and SEBI, to really design, forward-looking policies and regulations that put the interest of all of these key players in this ecosystem first. And I think that's going to change the dynamic completely over the coming years.
What would still need to happen? Because it sounds like a lot of the very critical pieces are already in place and implemented by a very forward-looking and entrepreneurial regulator compared to many other places in the world.
Absolutely. So I think, all credit to the RBI. They do a fantastic job of making sure that there is security and safety for consumers and businesses and the other players like fintech companies in India. I think, unfortunately, and this is, this is not this is not pointing a finger to the RBI. This is true for every country and every economy and every regulatory body globally, is regulators and policymakers, unfortunately, are always playing catch up to technological innovation. It's just going to be the case. We don't have entrepreneurs in regulatory bodies today, but hopefully we will, right? You might have an entrepreneur in residence at the RBI at some point. And I think it's just that. I think there is a mismatch, and I think it's about making sure that whatever guidelines and frameworks that exist today, we're able to continue to improve on them, continue to iterate on them, and continue to make sure that they keep innovation and safety and security at its forefront, right, and in focus. And I think as long as that happens, it's going to make sure that all of the industry participants operate in ethical manners, are responsible, and at the end of the day are able to drive the kind of economic impact that we want to in unlocking the economic potential of millions and tens of millions of these micro entrepreneurs and small businesses. Sorry.
I want to go back to the early days for one more sec. Can you tell us a bit more about what was tough in the first year? And on the flip side of that, what were the glorious moments where you thought, yes,
oh man,
I love it?
I think at least we as leaders struggle with, right? And I think, even at Uber, it was the kind of the same thing. Even throughout the journey, it's been the same thing, which is everything is a struggle in the initial days, right? Like everything is tough because you don't know what you don't know, and you only know after you've made a mistake. So like you have to sort out like legal, compliance, tech, like what do you do first? Do you have to focus on marketing? Do you have to focus on finding new customers? Do you focus on finding one lender or multiple lenders? everything was tough, is what I would say, right? I think the other thing was we were also, and what continues to be really, I would say, a big challenge is because we took this approach of being a tech-first company and really focusing on the technology aspect of our own proprietary tech stack in-house to drive all of this, right? So we've not, for example, we've not bought an LOS and LMS system off the shelf, which you can very easily do, right? We've built everything in-house. I think with that comes an incredible amount of the unknown, because if we're trying to redesign essentially think of a customer journey or a flow, right, of doing small business lending, we're not taking any references, right? And so we're kind of building in the dark, and that was really tough. And that continues to be really tough because we're constantly trying to design efficiencies and build improvements in a product and a flow that's never been built before, right? So I think that's really tough because sometimes it's like the reference I use is I'm a scuba diver. So it's like diving when sometimes you dive near reefs and like near islands and whatnot. And you have a reference because there's a reef down there, right? So whether you're 20 meters below or 30 meters below, there's a reference in terms of depth because you have this reef on your right or left or behind you. Or you have the seafloor below you. But when you're diving in the deep blue, right, or as they say in the blue, which is a bit further out, where there's no reefs and there's no landmass surrounding you, you kind of lose perspective because you're diving with nothing around you besides water, right? And I hats off to the way the scuba instructors do it. I'm not that experienced yet, but navigating through that and like knowing where you're going, that comes with experience, right? And I think over time we're getting better at that. But in those initial days, it was incredibly hard because we wanted to build something, but it's almost like we didn't know what we were building. We had an idea of what we were building, and that's what we went towards. But we made a lot of mistakes along the way.
And the glorious moments.
Man, I don't think, that's the other thing. I think, I think, well, the first time we were able to do a deal was great, right? The first time we were able to do a deal within like end to end from when it came in to when we funded them within like 72 hours. Can you imagine that? Being able to give a business like, $50,000 in 72 hours. Like that was magical for us as well because we were like, wow, we actually can do this. I think scaling up when we did our first, essentially 10 crores of disbursement, which is just over $1 million. We did our first 100 crores of disbursements. And when we did our 1,000 crores of disbursements, things like that. I think it's the small milestones along the way are glorious, but very often as a team, as leaders, we get bogged down with the day-to-day fires that we're fighting and we don't get to enjoy these moments. But I think there have been so many of these over the last 4 years. And we actually were able to celebrate some of these a couple of weeks ago. So we did our first company offsite. And man, it's incredible to think we're now a 100-person strong team. That just blows my mind.
That's
right?
Fantastic. In a couple of years. It's very impressive.
Yeah, in 4 years. And it's fascinating because we had Amit and Bhavik on stage at this offsite, and they were sharing some photos from the early days. And the first office, which was, it was like a broom closet, right? It had a small desk, a 2-seater desk, and it was a broom closet. And we had this little notepad, or what do you call it, like a sticky pad, a sticky notes pad. And it was like the first to-do list that they were showing the rest of the team, right, in terms of what they had to build. And to go from that to now being in a really cool office that we have here in Bombay, which is our headquarters, and we have 80 people sitting here, that I think is something to truly celebrate and be grateful for.
That's fantastic.
But it's just another, it's one of those milestones in a long journey ahead, right?
There will
very
be,
grateful for it.
There will be many more, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Karun, I'd like to talk a little bit about your original craft as well of a comm/PR person. In the spirit of learning, in your mind, what's that role about and what makes for a very good head of comms?
I think people undervalue comms and marketing in most organizations, unfortunately. And it gets clubbed under marketing, and then marketing budgets are always the first to be questioned and slashed and things like that. But without comms and marketing, you wouldn't have sales, right? And you wouldn't have a business in many cases. So I think comms and marketing becomes really important because it's about helping people It's about building trust and credibility in a company, in people, in a product, in a service. And I think without that, you don't really have the intrinsic value of something which people can believe in, right? And aspire to be in a way. And I'm talking about both internally and externally. So there's internal comms, which is really important to ensure that everyone within an organization is aligned to the mission, the North Star, and everyone externally, customers, policymakers, investors, etc., all believe in what you're doing as well, right? Otherwise, they're not going to use your product or service. And I think that becomes really hard. And, it's obviously changed over the years. But, at its core, PR is public relations. And to me, it's all about being able to design a very powerful and strong narrative for a company that presents what that company is doing to all external stakeholders. And I just mentioned some of those. So it could be customers, it could be policymakers, it could be investors, shareholders in a company if you're a public company, or it could be employees, as I said, if you're a private company. These are just a few of the audiences. There could obviously be many, many more. But it's about making sure you're constantly engaging with these stakeholders and these audiences and continue to drive trust, which, if you do your job really well, at the end of the day is going to drive some sort of business outcome. Right?
And what are the key three things you'd recommend non-PR experts could do to basically get their game up to maybe average compared to a great PR person, but stuff they can take away from this conversation from you as an expert in that field?
Well, I think, you don't need to have PR experience. I think media relations should be at the top of the table, and media relations, by that I mean just going out there and speaking to media, right? Being transparent, being open, building relations with your key media. It could be a TechCrunch, it could be a Wall Street Journal, it could be Gentleman's Quarterly, right? GQ. I mean, depending on what you do as a business. And I think that becomes really important because you have to treat the media like another important stakeholder in your business. Although they are the conduit for information that is going out to all of the other stakeholders, right? And you may not value media relationships when everything is going really well. But the moment you're in crisis, man, the amount of time and effort spent, and I mean this from more of a time and effort point of view than any monetary sort of point of view, but the amount of time and effort spent in building those relationships, and that happens over years, are priceless when stuff hits the fan and things are not going well, right? So media relations for me would be number one. Two would be being proactive, right? Being proactive about getting your message out there, being mindful of the different channels and avenues which are both owned and earned that you can leverage. What I mean by that is, you could have a newsroom and a really fantastic blog with fantastic content on your blog, and you could repurpose that content for your social media channels and other channels like that. That becomes really important. So understanding how and where you can leverage those channels to communicate externally. And I think number three would be finding the right person internally, because having one really solid internal person is really important in driving those relationships and managing that kind of narrative. And at the same time, doing media training, right? So making sure at least one of the core leaders in the organization are really well versed with how to interact with media, because it's very easy to make mistakes and it's very easy to fumble when asked tough questions. And that's something any PR person worth their salt will say is something you need to be able to mitigate and avoid.
It's absolutely a skill that can be trained. So that's great. Thanks for the crash course there, Karun. And in terms of your own personal journey, you grew up in India, but you went to high school and to uni in the States. What triggered your move there?
And I mean, I grew up in Bombay in India. It's sort of like the financial capital of India, kind of like New York. Big city, sort of a mega city. It's got 30 million people. So the reason I moved to the US for high school, 2 years of high school in my undergrad, was there is this sort of, I want to say culture, but if you have that opportunity, it's important that you're able to take advantage of it. And I was very lucky to have, fantastic parents, a fantastic upbringing who were able to give me that opportunity to go abroad. And I think for me, the thing that I value the most is just the international exposure you get at a very young age. It gives you the ability to be independent. And what I mean by that is to start thinking independently and fending for yourself, being responsible. The third is getting that international exposure, right? And what I mean by that is not just to Americans in high school and things like that, but to the international student population in those markets. And I think that for me is invaluable, right? Because you're getting so many worldly perspectives, which sitting in India, I just would not have got. And it gave me the ability to have a global network today, 20 years later. It's given me fantastic friends along the way. And it's also it's helped open many doors for me in my career over the years. And I think that's what I value the most.
And what was it like to move to Singapore after?
Wow. I think even moving to the States was fascinating. I loved it. And moving to Singapore as well was great. I think when I moved there, I was much younger. I moved there in 2010s. That's 14 years ago. I was in my 20s then, or mid 20s. And it was great, right? But it was also a bit sterile. At least that's how I felt at the time. But then after having lived there, matured there, built up a really strong base in Singapore, I think it's one of the best countries in the world to be in and run business from. And if you can, everything works. It's extremely progressive in their business mindset. And it is just very conducive for people doing business and for raising families as well, because it's so safe. But Singapore was fascinating. Loved it. Loved every moment of it. Have absolutely zero regrets, which I think is really important in life. And I would highly recommend being able to go to Singapore for anybody anywhere in the world, to be honest. I think it's a melting pot of culture. It's a melting pot of business. Many multinational corporations have their Asian headquarters in Singapore. Some companies also have headquarters outside of their home base, whether it's in the UK or it's in the US, is in Singapore. And that's fascinating, right? Even from a manufacturing standpoint. I used to work for Rolls Royce back in the day. And this is Rolls Royce PLC, which makes aeroplane engines, marine engines, all of those incredible power systems for modern industry. And Singapore was the only country outside of the UK where Rolls Royce invested something like $700 million. And I'm talking about 10 years ago or even longer now. It's almost 2 decades ago, to set up their first aerospace manufacturing facilities.
Oh, wow.
Right? Because of the IP protection, because of the kind of support they got from the government and the talent base there. And I think that becomes a really powerful trifecta for anybody looking to do business.
And now you're back in India after quite a long time. How has the country changed? It sounds like the country is going through tremendous change.
It has. So I have, to be very honest, I kind of miss being back in Southeast Asia as well. But I know why I'm here. And yes, so any perspective will have its good pros and cons. And I kind of have the good and bad of being back in India as well. I think India is the place to be. Okay, so don't get me wrong. I think India, over the next 10 to 20 years, if you want to make money, if you want to be part of a truly emerging economy that is going to essentially maybe overtake some of the other economies that we know, like Japan and Germany, etc., in the coming years, as we go from 3 trillion to hopefully a 5 trillion and then a $8 trillion economy over the next decades. The kind of opportunity you see here in India, you don't see anywhere else. The kind of activity you see here, you don't really see anywhere else. The kind of investment and appetite you see here, you're not seeing anywhere else, right? I think the kind of entrepreneurship activity that you're seeing here, you're also not seeing anywhere else. So from that regard, it's fantastic, right? I think the regards that and this is only from living in a first world country, in a truly developed bubble, which I call Singapore, for 14 years. I think we're, as a country and as infrastructure, we have 100 years to go behind a first world economy from an infrastructure standpoint. And I'm talking about simple things like road infrastructure, hygiene, basic civic sense, things like that, right? And I think there's a long, long way to go. And I hope we get there. There's certainly major investments being made by the government into things like transportation infrastructure, right? You're seeing this, I'm seeing this firsthand in Bombay, where for the longest time, Bombay being sort of an island city, we knew it required a road around the city like you have in New York, like the FDR is in New York. But because of the corruption, because of the different changes in government, priorities, all of that over the last 30 years, this should have been a project that kicked off and was completed 20 years ago. But it's still under construction, and hopefully it is something that gets completed in the next 5 years. But it will change how people get to and from and within the city, right? It'll change mobility within the financial capital of the country.
Yeah.
So projects like this are a work in progress, and India is a work in progress, right?
What
but
places?
I think it has untapped potential.
What places should people go to really understand the India of 2024?
Definitely Bombay. I invite everybody to come to Bombay. We're actually GetVantage is part of a really cool organization here called Team, which is the Tech Entrepreneurs Association in Mumbai. And what we're aiming to do and trying to do is make Mumbai the tech hub. It's traditionally over the last 10, 15 years, Hyderabad was a tech hub, and then Bangalore has become a startup hub as well. And the idea is to make Mumbai a tech hub and sort of a startup hub also. But I think coming to the metros and these big tier 1 cities is very important. But it's also very important to travel to some of the smaller cities in India, right? Go to Surat, go to Pune, go to Lucknow, Ahmedabad. There is so much activity happening in some of these smaller cities as well. And I think it's really important for people to get a holistic flavor of what's happening in India and not just be enamored by what's happening in these bigger cities.
Got it. And Karun, we just talked about your journey in the first years of GetVantage. How did that change you as a person? You've sort of matured professionally in larger sort of scale-up kind of companies, and you're really running your own. How has that changed you through the downs and the ups?
Yeah, I really think, when our parents, as we grow up in life, and you could say this is a lesson, the older generation, whether it's your parents, uncles, aunts, whoever, teachers tell you as you're growing up, is maturity comes with age and experience. That becomes truly invaluable, as we mature and we go through that experience in our careers ourselves. I think being able to handle difficult situations, right? Being able to face challenges with positivity and optimism as opposed to pessimism, and being able to get people, teams, colleagues, peers to work in alignment is really key. And I think that only happens through experience, right? As a young, brash person in my, early 20s working in my first company, I didn't know anything, but I thought I knew it all. And very quickly you realize you know nothing, and you have to be able to rely on others, right? And I think the one other thing I want to mention is entrepreneurship is really, really hard. And people should not underestimate the power of being able to say no and being able to ask for help, right? Because you don't know it all. I don't know it all, right? Even today, I might have 15 years of PR and marketing and comms experience, but I don't know it all. I have a great team here today at GetVantage who I'm always asking for advice. I'm sounding ideas off them because they bring a fresh perspective to the table, right? So I think the other thing is always be willing to learn, or always be a student, right, of life and your subject. And I think the last thing is also is never be afraid to fail. You're going to always fail. If you're afraid to fail, you'll never take those chances, open those doors, take the opportunity that comes your way, because you're going to be afraid of failure. Don't be afraid of failure. And that's something I've only learned through experience.
I was about to ask, and that's already part of the answer to this question, but have you changed your mind on certain things, maybe on certain values, certain assumptions throughout the experience of starting GetVantage?
Yeah. I think the one really interesting thing that I've started to try and force myself to do more of is not view what I want through my perception of something, but really try and have a different perspective on something. And perspective comes from maturity of being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and look at a particular scenario through somebody else's shoes and not your own. That is something that I truly value, and is something I work hard at trying to be able to do every day. Because if you're able to do that, what it allows you to do, and what you get better at by proxy, is it allows you to respond and not react to situations, which I think is what we, like the human tendency is to react, right? Whether you're talking to your partner, your husband, your wife, your brother, your sister, your parents, friends, whoever, colleagues, customers, complaints from people, right? The natural human tendency is to react and be aggressive or funny or whatever. But I think the mature thing to do is to be able to respond in a certain manner.
And the difference in your mind being reactive, being a bit more maybe automatic and defensive, and responding is more about acknowledging the issue that the other brings up?
Yes, I think when you're reacting, you're doing so mindlessly. When you're responding, you're doing so mindfully.
Those are the beautiful insights to almost end this conversation on, Karun. It's been super interesting talking to you. Loved hearing more about GetVantage, the early days, what you're doing now, what's still ahead of you, and also get to know you a bit better personally. Do you have any last words to wrap up on?
No, not really. Hugo, I want to firstly thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you. It's been so fun chatting with you, and even prior to this conversation, just catching up from our times at Uber and what we've been up to over the years. And I really love what you're doing with Founder Radio, right? I do hope that, I guess, just the stories that people like us have to share are able to add a lot of value to others out there, right? Like, it piques their interest in a certain way. It gives them certain amount of confidence to go do something. It inspires them in whatever they might be doing. And or it makes them ask some tough questions as well. Because being a founder, just having that founder's mindset is very, very difficult, right? And I think the one thing I didn't mention at all in this conversation, but which I want to end with, is being founders, and especially if you have co-founders, it's incredibly hard because you have to be able to trust in the other person and have them trust you, and there has to be transparency and collaboration, and you're also going to get on each other's nerves and things like that. At its core, you have to be able to have really difficult conversations very often and be able to trust in what the other person's judgment is all about, right? I think that's what being strong co-founders, having a really good team means and is going to be absolutely crucial to success. So I hope people find that. I hope people find these conversations and some of what I had to say of interest and of some value. Apart from that, I just want to say if anybody is listening from India and is running a small business and needs access to short-term working capital, please come talk to us. We'd love to help.
Awesome. GetVantage.co, right?
Absolutely.
Amazing. That was a super fun conversation, Karun. Very inspiring. Really appreciate the kind words about Founder Radio. That's exactly what we're trying to do. Best of luck with GetVantage, and hope to catch up with you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you, Hugo. This was fantastic.
Fantastic.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Cheers.